My name is Walter Pruitt, and I have sat in the back row of more recitals than I can count. 40 years of teaching grammar to children who would rather be anywhere else does that to a man. It makes him grateful for any room where people sit quietly and listen to something beautiful. So when my granddaughter invited me to her school's memorial concert, the one they hold every spring for a beloved music teacher who'd passed the year before, I went gladly, expecting an evening of earnest, slightly off-key tributes from children with more heart than technique. I did not expect Maestro Aldous Varick. He was the guest of honor, a celebrated concert pianist, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, the kind of man whose photograph belongs on the sleeve of a record album. He had apparently known the late teacher decades ago, before either of them was famous, and the school had invited him to close the evening with a piece in her memory. The children went first. One by one they shuffled up, played their pieces, some lovely, some halting, and Varick sat in the front row, nodding with the practiced patience of a man who has heard 1,000 recitals and remembers none of them. Then came the boy. He couldn't have been more than 7, small, even for 7. The piano bench swallowed him, and his feet didn't reach the floor. He wore a blue sweater with a button missing, and he climbed onto the bench the way children do, with both hands, like he was scaling something. His name, the program said, was Theo. He was not on the official list of performers. I learned later, from his mother, who told me afterward with her hands shaking around a paper cup of punch, that Theo had asked, just that afternoon, if he could play something, not for an audience, just for the woman in the photograph at the front of the hall, the teacher, who had given him free lessons on Tuesdays after school, because his family couldn't afford them, and who had died before he'd had the chance to play for her properly. The school had said yes, mostly to be kind. They hadn't expected Varick to still be in the room, and Varick, I want to be fair to him, because by the end of the night I understood him better than I wanted to. Varick had spent 2 hours listening to children mangle Clementi, sonatinas, and he was tired, and he was a man unaccustomed to being tired in public. When the boy sat down and the program announcer said, almost apologetically, and now a piece chosen by Theo in memory of Mrs. Halloway, Varick let out a small laugh, not loud, not cruel. Exactly, the kind of laugh a man doesn't even notice himself making, the laugh of someone who has simply stopped expecting to be moved. Go on then, he said, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, leaning toward the woman beside him with that same tired smile. Let's see what the little ones are calling music these days. A few people near him chuckled, not unkindly, just the reflexive laugh people give when a famous man makes a joke. I didn't laugh. I was watching the boy's face, and I saw something cross it that I recognized from 40 years of classrooms. The look of a child who has heard exactly what was said and understood exactly what it meant and decided not to let it touch him. Theo placed his small hands on the keys, and then he closed his eyes. I should tell you what he played, because the choice of it is the whole story. It was Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, Op. 48 No. 1, not the famous E-flat one that gets played at every recital in the world, but the other one, the one that opens like a slow procession, and then, 2 minutes in, breaks into something almost violent before settling back into grief. It is not a child's piece. It is barely a beginner's piece. The opening alone asks for a kind of restraint that most adult pianists spend years learning. Long, spaced chords, a melody that has to sing without ever rushing, silence held just as carefully as sound. The first notes came out slow, almost too slow. For a moment, just a moment, I thought my heart sank for him, thought maybe Varick's laugh had rattled him after all and he'd lost his nerve. But then I understood. He wasn't unsteady, he was waiting. Each chord rang out, and he let it die completely before reaching for the next one, the way you'd let someone finish a sentence before you spoke. The hall, which had been full of the soft rustle and cough of 200 restless people, went still in a way I have rarely heard a room go still, not the held-breath silence of anticipation, but the deeper silence of people suddenly realizing they are in the presence of something they don't have a name for. The melody unfolded, that long, mournful line, rising and falling like a voice, trying to say something it had been holding in for a long time, and Theo's small hands moved across, keys his fingers could barely span, reaching for octaves that should have been impossible for hands that size, and somehow making them sound not strained but inevitable, as though the music had been written for exactly this. For small hands, for a boy in a sweater with a missing button, for a Tuesday afternoon kindness that had outlived the woman who gave it. And then came the middle section, the part that breaks. The tempo surged, the chords turned dark and insistent, almost angry, and I watched this 7-year-old boy lean into the keyboard with his whole small body, his face no longer composed but open, his eyebrows drawn together in something that looked, for all the world, like grief finally being allowed to speak. It was loud, it was, for one stretch of perhaps 30 seconds, almost frightening, the sound of something enormous trying to fit through a doorway too small for it. I have heard concert pianists play that passage with more polish. I have never heard anyone play it with more truth. Beside me, an elderly woman. I learned afterward she had been Mrs. Halloway's sister. Put her hand over her mouth. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the storm passed, and the music folded back into that slow opening melody, except now it sounded different. Not grief anymore, but something gentler, something like acceptance, like a hand finally being let go after being held too tight for too long. The final chords came one at a time, each one quieter than the last, until the very last note hung in the air and Theo lifted his hands and simply let it fade. He didn't look up. He sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes still closed, as though he were listening to the silence, the way he'd listened to the music. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the room came apart. Not politely, not the warm, dutiful applause you give a child at a recital. People were on their feet before they knew they'd stood. Somewhere behind me, a man was openly weeping. The elderly woman beside me, Mrs. Halloway's sister, had both hands pressed to her face, and when Theo finally opened his eyes and looked out, startled, at 200 people on their feet, she was the first one to reach him, kneeling down beside the bench and taking his small hands in hers and saying something I couldn't hear but didn't need to. I looked at Varric. He was not standing. For a long moment he simply sat there, very still, and I watched something move across his face that I can only describe as a man hearing a door close on a version of himself he'd thought he'd left behind years ago. Then slowly he rose. He didn't applaud. Not at first. He walked, instead, down the side aisle to the front of the hall, and the room, sensing something, quieted just enough to let him pass. He crouched down in front of the piano bench, so that he was below the boy rather than above him, and for a moment he didn't say anything at all. When he did speak, his voice had none of the tiredness from before. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Theo, still a little overwhelmed, glanced toward the photograph at the front of the hall. The smiling, gray-haired woman in the frame, surrounded by flowers, and said simply, "Mrs. Halloway taught me, on Tuesdays." Varric looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked back at the boy, and he reached out and shook his small hand, formally, the way you'd greet a colleague. "Thank you for that," he said. "I haven't heard that piece played like it meant something in a very long time. I'm sorry for what I said before you started. That was unkind, and you didn't deserve it." I don't think Theo entirely understood what was being apologized for, but he nodded, the way children do when an adult is being serious, and said, "That's okay," and Varric laughed again. But it was a different laugh this time, soft and a little broken, the laugh of a man who has just been handed back something he'd forgotten he'd lost. He never played his own piece that night. He told the school afterward that nothing he had prepared belonged in the same room as what they'd just heard, and instead he sat in the front row for the rest of the evening between Theo and Mrs. Halloway's sister, and from where I sat, I could see him wipe his eyes more than once. I've been to a great many recitals since, and I expect I'll go to a great many more, but I think of that night more than any of them, of a boy in a sweater with a missing button, who turned a famous man's careless laugh into the quietest, fullest silence I have ever heard a room hold, and then filled it with a goodbye none of us, least of all Varric, ever expected to receive.